Hello, croeso, shwmae, welcome to the Welsh Politics podcast, where we talk about what's happening in the world of Welsh politics, why it's happening, and what it means. I'm joined by Professor Laura McAllister from Cardiff University and Lauren McEvatt, former Conservative Special Advisor and now consultant. And I'm Lee Waters, and I'm a member of the Senedd. And in this episode, we want to unpack the changes to the Welsh Parliament that we're going to see coming next May. Laura, you and Lauren were both on one of the more recent commissions. You've been on, I think, on every commission there's ever been. So perhaps you can explain to us what this change is about and what it means and how it looks.
I can. I haven't been on every commission there's been, but I've been on a fair few of them.
Which one did you miss?
Yeah, I'm one of those people who's deemed to be a perennial commissioner, but hopefully there's been some contribution through those as well.
You were on the Richard Commission.
I was on the Richard Commission 2002 to 2004, which actually, in many respects, is the start of Assembly Senedd reform, because it talked about electoral system and size. And then I chaired the expert panel on Assembly electoral reform, as it was called, in 2017, which devised an alternative model for the Assembly as was then. We talked about a range of 80 to 90 MSs using STV, and of course recommended that the voting age should be reduced to include 16 and 17-year-olds as well. And then more recently, obviously worked with Lauren on the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. But I think in many respects, the expert panel did the hard lifting in terms of the evidence base for changing the format and structure of the Senedd. And where we are now, of course, is 7 months away from the election. We'll be voting for a larger Parliament of 96 MSs through a different electoral system, closed list PR, in big mega constituencies which have been formed through pairing the 32 Westminster seats and then electing 6 MSs for each of those.
And there's many a slip between cup and lip. How does what we've ended up with reflect sort of the evidence and the careful consideration these commissions gave us?
In size terms, fairly closely. In electoral systems, not at all is probably the best analysis. In size terms, I think I can understand the logic of having 96, and there's a mathematical formula, of course, which lends itself to 96 based on constituencies and distribution of population and so on. But our recommendation back in 2017 was for a threshold of 80 to 90 MSs. And I have to say that beyond that, the evidence becomes less compelling for the numbers, because comparative data then is weakened in terms of other systems, and the formula that we'd used around degree of powers and competence, population and so on. But I can live with 96, because I think it does future-proof the Parliament for acquiring additional competencies, particularly over justice, should that happen, because big should that happen, of course, but because obviously that's very scrutiny intensive as well. When it comes to electoral system, I mean, let's just get it out there from the outset. Closed list PR was one of the electoral systems that we rejected in the very early stage of our analysis of different electoral systems, notwithstanding the fact, of course, that there are weaknesses and strengths to every electoral system, and you'll never have one that ticks every box. But what we tried to do back in 2017 was have a set of criteria, values as much as anything, that we felt should be enshrined in a more proportional electoral system. Hardly any of those are carried forward with closed list PR. And the most significant thing to say, of course, is that it reduces voter choice and gives more authority to the parties in terms of candidates. Now, there's also an argument about how important the candidate is vis-a-vis the party, but nevertheless, one of the principles of voting systems traditionally and historically in Britain has been that people go out and vote for a candidate that represents a party rather than the other way around. So clearly there's been issues raised, but we are where we are.
Yeah, well, I've a degree of the arc of history to this myself, because hearing you speak there reminds me, my first job was working for Ron Davies when he was Welsh Secretary, who brought in a lot of these changes and brought in the original system, which has been unwound ever since. And he always used to rail against bloody academics who had these perfectly theoretical systems that politically you just couldn't get over the line. And I guess that's the difference between what the theory tells you would be good and what you can actually deliver practically.
Yes, and I'm going to stick up for academics here, as you'd expect me to, but be careful what you wish for as well, as we no doubt we'll come on to.
Yeah, well, he was quite wrong because the system he brought in collapsed, but it was the best he could get.
And we may have a repeat of that with closed list PR, of course, in terms of outcomes for the people who have supported it, in this case, Welsh Labour. But let's come on to that.
Well, I think that's key to it, really, isn't it? Because, the politics of this is difficult because nobody wants to support more politicians. It's easy, and the Conservatives are, banging on to it about the extra cost, and it's a populist position that resonates with most people.
Absolutely, and it's an easy thing for Conservative politicians to turn around and say, 120 million. How could you have spent that differently? How many nurses is that? How many more doctors is that? How many more operations is that? And with a health system in Wales that is struggling, that's a fairly attractive, media-wise, line to put into the public domain. What I think it's
a bit of a misleading claim because it's £34 million a year from the cost of the extra MSs and their staff.
And this is what I was going to go on to about what needs to change in Welsh politics is, 60 MAs as they were MSs now.
AMs,
AMs, of course, sorry. AMs then and MSs now. Very clearly, at the point at which 60 were introduced, more powers had gone down by the time this commission was taking place. We needed more bodies in the building in order to adequately scrutinise what the government was doing. It's very hard to have a governing party backbench if you're having to make basically almost everybody a minister. And, a backbench to a governing party, I believe, is an important feature. It sort of keeps them honest. So I think there was a need for more. So I disagree with my party in saying, that there was no more required, but I would have liked to see maybe about 80. And I think that the closed list system is something that central office would design and not necessarily the parliamentarians themselves. How you scrutinise a candidate going in, what are their previous financial dealings? What do they do for a living? Your ability to say, I want this person and their background to represent me is taken away from you as a voter.
Can we come back to the list and talk about numbers first? Yeah. Because I think, the Conservative position is disingenuous because they wouldn't have had any in the first place. They were opposed to devolution. So when they're saying 60 is enough, they didn't want any.
And of course, my party is currently trying to talk about why it shouldn't be expanded so they don't have to talk about the big bogeyman in the Conservative room, which is, should we abolish it?
Yeah, sure.
And we have Conservative voters in Wales who are in favour of retaining the Senedd, and we have Conservative members in Wales who, in their almost majority, are in favour of abolition. And treading that line is very difficult for the party to tread. And so talking about this instead, talking about numbers, means we do have to talk about that.
Can I make the argument for evidence-based analysis as well?
As
you, yes.
Not.
I feel it's my duty to do this. Yeah, it is my duty, and obviously,
it'll never fly, Lee. It'll never fly.
If you look back at the report of Parliament that Works for Wales that we produced as an expert panel, we had some fine people on that group, by the way. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this was my report. This was written by some very, very good practitioners as well, people who'd worked in the House of Commons, in the Scottish Parliament, Northern Ireland and so on. And what we did try and do was create a measured case for expansion of the Senedd, because if you look at the history, I'm not suggesting we go into all the reasons why we were lumbered with such a back-of-the-fag packet model of devolution, because we know a lot of that. But it became quickly aware that the model of devolution we had was dysfunctional, and a big part of that was based on the fact that there just weren't enough backbenchers as such to scrutinise government effectively and populate the committees and run business in the way that business should be run in a parliamentary environment. And I think it's very easy still for people to throw at the Senedd expansion argument, why don't you sit more often, why don't you minimise recess, why don't you shave off some of the committee time and so on. But if you read A Parliament That Works for Wales, we did all of that. We did the analysis on that, and we showed what the consequences would be of doing that. And they didn't add up to creating a fit-for-purpose, functional parliamentary system. The thing that always sticks with me is that, there is still in the body of MPs at Westminster over 100 who have no roles other than being MPs from a constituency. whereas it's completely different, not only in Wales, but less so in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Now, you know, there are lots of important functions of a parliament, obviously, but in this case, one of the most important functions was not being conducted adequately, and that was scrutiny. So for me, the argument around scrutiny in itself allows us to justify 96. But I take all the understandings of how the public sees this. It was never ever going to be popular, and there was never ever going to be a good time to do it. But this is as good a time as any, is the only way you can.
Sure, and I think the bit that I don't think features in the argument is why 60? So we're trying to preserve 60. Whoever came up with 60? And you know, that was about an internal row within the Labour Party in the 90s. And the original proposals had either 80 or 120. And it was Tony Blair, when he was writing the manifesto, and who decided there had to be a referendum in Scotland. He didn't care about Wales. It was Ron Davies who agreed we had to have one in Wales, not to be seen to be inferior to Scotland from the get-go. And Blair said, well, if we're going to have a referendum, cost is going to be a big issue, so let's go for 60. So it's a defensible political judgment, particularly when it was passed so narrowly. But you know, there was no design principle behind 60. This was just
and smaller than 10, I think, of the Welsh local authorities in numbers. So you're back to the formula of working out how many politicians you need to make an institution properly function.
And the point I like to make is, you know, Carmarthenshire Council has more councillors than the Welsh Parliament has MSs, which is bonkers.
Isn't that an argument in favour of reducing the size of Carmarthenshire Council?
100%. But good luck with that. And that's the problem, isn't it? That tension between the academic analysis and the political reality of what can you get over the line. And that's, I guess, what's so interesting about where we've ended up. Yes, okay, we've ended up at the upper end of the numbers, and from a pro-devolution point of view, wanting a stronger parliament, I think that's a judgment of let's get the maximum we can get away with, because we're not going to come back to this again for at least another generation.
And remember how they got over the line. It was because of the cooperation agreement between Labour and Plaid Cymru, because, you know, obviously that was the built-in majority in terms of getting a supermajority, and the deal that created a 96-seat Senedd with closed list PR was agreed between the two parties.
Well, I think it's even more opaque than that, Laura. I had a ringside seat to some of this, but it was a ringside seat with an obscured view, interestingly enough, because this was very much
like the closed list system.
Indeed, and this is very much a Mark Drakeford piece of political work.
I was going to come on to that, but in the first instance, without the cooperation agreement, this wouldn't have been kick-started in the way it was. Then it went into the even more opaque space that you're about to describe.
Yeah, so, you know, I think the story here is that Mark Drakeford, having been around since the beginning of devolution, after having gone through all these expert reports over years, constant case of, you know, all the evidence and all the experience tells us we need more members. All the members would say that in private meetings. We need more members. This is not sustainable. This is poor work. But very few would then stand up and say, we support more members. So I think Mark Drakeford got to the point of saying, well, if not now, when? If we don't take this leap, we will never be able to follow the evidence and get a properly functioning parliament.
And of course, what was travelling alongside this consideration in the last sort of 15 years was an increasing attempt at Westminster to reduce the number of MPs at Westminster, to bring that number down from 650 to 600.
And there's no science behind that number either.
And to try and reform the boundaries so that they were more evenly spaced between rural and
political fix by the Conservatives.
Well, it's not a closed list system, a political fix by the Labour Party. Yeah. You know, all of these things are gerrymandering to one political objective or another. I don't think you can possibly sit there and deny that.
Just remember that when you're preaching.
Oh, absolutely, but I don't believe you can sit there and deny that there are political objectives to most electoral reform historically.
True, but most of those political objectives backfire as well, and we may be about to see another example of that with closed list PR.
Yeah, I don't think there was much of a party political agenda behind this. I think this was very much a Mark Drakeford-led agenda of, I have political capital post-COVID election. what do I want my impact, my legacy to be? We've never used those terms. But what change can I carry through? And Senedd reform was change that he wanted to do. Now, there was no groundswell of support for that within the Labour Party or anywhere else. He used his personal political capital, especially with the MPs who really didn't want this at all.
Yes, but
to push that through.
I get all of that. I think you're absolutely right, and I think it was, without wishing to get into Mark Drakeford's head, I think it was a legacy project for him, you know, and why not? There's nothing wrong with that. He knew he was standing down, you know, why not have
But that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I was trying to make is like the political element.
Let me just finish the point, because it's not, I think you're right about the size and getting that through, but let's talk about the closed list.
Yeah.
That wasn't on the cards at the end.
No, that was a political compromise.
Absolutely.
You know, what can you give? And what's interesting, reflecting on the process. So this was all, when I said I had an obscured view, this was all done very much behind closed doors. So as soon as that 2021 election happened, this was a project Mark Drakeford set off in private. He'd put some words in the manifesto which alluded to the change but didn't flesh it out in any detail. And as soon as that election was done and the deal with Plaid was done, he set about a process within the Labour Party to agree a unified position within the party. And he did that as party leader, not as First Minister. So this was hardly discussed in Cabinet. And when it was, I'm telling you this as information, not for discussion, because I'm doing this not as First Minister, but as leader of Welsh Labour. So, you know, he's a canny operator, as Mark, despite his, you know, some of vicarish appearance sometimes. This was a very shrewd political operation to get a deal done.
Now, because obviously a deal requires two sides here. Which side of the deal did the closed list suggestion come from? Was it Labour or was it Plaid?
Oh no, absolutely Labour.
Definitely not
So
Plaid.
why is it that it's in Labour's benefit for a closed list rather than an open one?
Well, I'm not sure it is. I don't think it is at all. I think STV...
Why did you suggest it then?
Well, because, it's complicated, Laura.
Yeah, but let's talk about that, because this is, you know, none of us have got you're closer than anybody, Lee, but I don't think even you know exactly what was going on in those conversations between Welsh Labour MPs and the Senedd group via Mark Drakeford. And there is no doubt at all in my mind that this was weirdly put forward by Welsh Labour MPs. I don't know why, because it might at one very simple level have looked like a system that would benefit Labour and gave more power to the party itself, undoubtedly. Yeah. But it wouldn't have taken a great genius to have worked out that this could backfire quite significantly should Labour suffer a slump in terms of its share of the vote. So, you know, tell us.
I think it was more accidental than that.
Okay.
So I think there was
cock-up or conspiracy?
Almost always a cock-up. So I think my reading of what happened is Mark wanted a Senedd package of reform delivered. The numbers were important. You know, the step forward was important. MPs generally have antibodies towards more devolution or more anything in Cardiff because they see it as a threat to their own position. Perfectly understandable human dynamics. So there was already a resistance to that. Mark Drakeford set up a subcommittee of the Welsh Executive Committee, which had the unions, it had the MPs, it had him and it had the party officials. And they, very much in secrecy, with opacity, came up with a package of proposals. And he had to negotiate hard within that to get it. Now, my understanding is that the MPs who were represented there didn't want extra numbers, but they accepted that was going to happen. What they weren't prepared to compromise on was electoral systems, because STV has always been the call of the Richard Commission onwards. Yeah. They did not like STV, partly because in Westminster there's an attachment to first past the post, and partly because, I mean, the individual hang-up. So, for example, Kevin Brennan, who was Mark Drakeford's a close constituency colleague and very influential with him, comes from an Irish family and has an experience of STV about promoting parochialism, getting internal candidates to be competing with each other from the voters rather than campaigning for the party as a whole, and really did not like the system and thought it would be a retrograde step for Wales. And I think that was very influential on Mark. Mark himself would have preferred STV, but what could he get through? And also, my understanding within that group, you know, the party officials did not play the role of the neutral civil service. You know, they had a view and they argued for it.
Were you legitimately anticipating Labour Party officials behaving in a neutral manner? Really? Absolutely. Honestly, I think that may be the most optimistic assessment of Labour Party headquarters I've ever heard.
But can we just stick with that idea of the role of the party, because, you know, whichever way you look at it, closed list PR gives enormous authority to the political party,
yes.
to party HQ, if you like.
As well.
Yeah, and to activists, because you're effectively creating power for selectorate, aren't you, rather than the electorate.
Absolutely.
And there is no doubt at all it takes authority and power and accountability away from voters. That's just a fact, really, in the bit. But I wonder if there was any real consideration of how the closed list PR system would work should Labour's fortunes change, or whether it was just, you know, a moment in time and there was no consideration that should Labour slump in the polls, and this could really backfire in terms of, I guess it was the latter. Nobody thought about it.
No. And also, you take it from Mark Drakeford's point of view, you know, he wants to sell a reform change to an unreceptive audience. So he has to maximise the positives to these, you know, to these people from their point of view.
Yeah. So you've got more power, basically.
Well, I think it was more, the Hunt system favours larger parties. And based on where Labour was in the polls at that time, Labour Party would do well out of this system, better than they would under STV. The problem with that is, you know, a party that slips under 30% gets punished by the Hunt system. At the time, it seemed inconceivable that Welsh Labour would go that far. But that's how it's turned out.
Whereas the Dahon system makes everybody else have a full attack of the Wibbles because it's so complicated to try and work out the maths on it.
I appreciate we don't want to go into the real intricacies of this, but I don't think that's actually true. You know, the modelling that we did for the 2017 work on this showed that STV, depending on the constituencies, would actually have benefited Labour more than a list PR system.
And I can remember Mark Drakeford at the Labour group meeting after that report came out with your annex, which he'd highlighted, showing that result.
Exactly.
There was not a receptive audience.
No, I appreciate that, but let's not lose the facts in this as well and suggest that the case was closed list PR was evidence to better Labour, because that's not true. That was a political decision, as you say, because there was no buy-in and that's fine.
It's an apparatchik Politburo. Let's shoehorn our favoured sons in, and they won't have to have any scrutiny. It's how, you know, it's the closed list version of Torsten Bell ending up in Swansea, which I guarantee you'd never been to before.
I think that's the end result. I don't think that's where it starts off. And I think, you know, as we all know, in politics, perception matters more than reality. And the fact is, there were, you know, the people who don't like STV really don't like STV.
Yeah, it's very polarising.
So there are people in the Labour group who hate it. Most people are agnostic. And the argument I always made is electoral systems are alphabeti spaghetti. You know, there are tons of them. They all have their advantages. They all have their disadvantages. First past the post has both. The AMS system has both. STV has both. Closed list has both. So big picture, do we want to deliver Senedd expansion, Senedd reform? Yes. If we don't do it now with Mark Drakeford as leader, we'll never get it over the line. So we can all have to make some compromises here. So I don't like closed lists, but I was prepared to back a system in the bigger picture.
I also think that there's a wider, more political problem here, which is that this is a further example. You'll say that you're a conservative, but I think there is a broader problem here.
I'll say I'm a conservative.
Of Welsh Labour almost permanently acting throughout the course of the last 27 or so years as if they would always be in power in the Bay, and not thinking further ahead to what if somebody else becomes a very serious challenger. And now we have a system that looks like reform will do incredibly well in as a challenger party, currently got no one elected.
Can I take that head on? Because Labour designed the system in 1997, 1998, a system designed to not give it a majority. Yeah. If Labour had really wanted to preserve its power, it would have brought in a first-past-the-post system.
No, I'm not talking about preserving power. I'm talking about being almost incapable of understanding that at some point they might not be in power. So no preparatory. So when we came in 2010 in Westminster, the intergovernmental relationship between Cardiff Bay and Westminster on a formal level was almost non-existent. It's been, 7 years since there'd been a joint ministerial council? A system designed as if Labour would always hold the levers of power at both ends of the M4, not designed around the formalised government mechanisms of somebody else might be in there.
And two things can be true at the same time, can't they? So you're right, Lee, you know, the commitment to some form of proportionality in the original assembly was down to Labour, but they didn't have that much choice, because to bring the rest of the parties with them, particularly applied at that time wouldn't have been possible if it was if a first past the post system was advocated. So I think that's fair.
Well, they could have delivered a first past the post without a referendum, which is what the party would have preferred.
Yeah, exactly. But we were in a slightly different climate as well, weren't we, in terms of trying to bring the other parties along. We had the National Assembly Advisory Group and the preparation leading to that. But in the conversations around devolution in the general sense. But as Lauren says, I think Lauren's right as well, in that once a party's been in power for as long as Labour has, then there does become a kind of impregnability about it, a sense that we're untouchable, and it's almost hard to imagine losing an election. I mean, somewhere at the back of everybody's minds there is an understanding we can't take elections for granted, but when you've won so many, because what does winning mean, as we've already discussed, but when you've been successful in so many elections, it is hard to comprehend being a party that's now on 12 to 15% in the polls. Did anybody in Labour think that was the case 2 years ago?
Sure, but I don't disagree with your end point, but I don't think this is a direct consequence of hubris. I think it's more a consequence of government is really hard. Holding any party together is really difficult. So you avoid the pain points if you can. So why think about the mechanics of government, or why think about what happens if you're doing badly? We got enough to worry about dealing with it today without going out and finding problems. Just make it even harder.
And this is a problem that exists across all major parties in government. I remember very clearly raising an issue with Oliver Letwin at one point when I was in the Wales office and being told that, Lauren, we can't think in 25-year terms, we have to think in 5-year terms. My problem is, when you talk about the Constitution, when you talk about the mechanics, I think when you're building something, you have to think about 25 years down the line and not 5 years down the line.
Are we asking the wrong people to think here?
Yes.
To be fair, politicians, I get your point.
It's the thinking isn't the problem, it's the doing is the problem.
Yeah,
well, it's the lack of thinking.
Well, no, but where's the thinking about future-proofing? But you can't really expect ministers,
the academics.
Yeah, well, okay, yeah, you can't expect us to do it either. But where is the thinking within the body politic of, in this case, Labour or in the Conservatives? Who's doing the thinking? Somebody's got to do some thinking.
I think we can look at individual examples. I think the Andrew Dunlop work on intergovernmental relations. Yeah. I think that's an example of let's try and fix this for the longer term, rather than in the immediate political expediency sense.
Yeah, and even though it hasn't happened,
that was never published.
I don't think it was published. It just wasn't enacted.
Yes. So it hasn't happened, but it's out there. Yeah. But who knows? It's like everything. Sometimes
it's good to see Welsh Government paid so much attention to it when it came out. So delighted.
But like everything, there's a moment for these things as well.
The Conservative government collapsed, Lauren. To be fair,
a couple times,
and didn't deliver on it.
A couple times in the middle there, actually. We really had a couple.
But you're right. There was a moment where proper discussions about machinery did start to happen, and for various reasons weren't followed through. And that's true of the current Labour government too. Sorry, Laura, you were saying.
No, I was just going to say, should we move on to talk about the implications of this for the political world, if you like, because we're 7 months away from a Senedd election. Let me just put this out there and challenge me if you think, but I don't think anybody has yet realised that we have a new electoral system. I'm talking about the general public now, or has a real understanding of what that means. And why would they, in a sense, but how confident are we that there will be sufficient information, knowledge, understanding? It's not a hard system to use, is it, at the end of the day? Because you go into a polling station and pick a party, basically. And in many respects, it's one of the simplest. But are we worried that people don't quite understand how that translates into their representatives for them in the Senedd?
I think one thing has filtered through, and one thing has absolutely not filtered through, and one thing is sort of in the middle. I think the thing that has filtered through is the closed list, actually. I think more people than we think are aware that they're about to not vote for a person for the first time. Yeah. The thing I think hasn't filtered through is the mega constituencies. I don't think people know what constituency they're about to be in. And as soon as all those farmers in Brecon and Radnorshire work out that they're now a coastal constituency and they can go and join the Merchant Navy, there'll be no going back for them there. But I think the third thing, which is kind of in the middle, is that people are aware that there's been a change. Yeah. But I don't think there's enough information about it. And I think if we look at you know, with the commission we sat on did some polling and worked out that 37% of the population of Wales accurately understood who ran which bit of the state, Westminster versus Cardiff.
I think all Western democracies.
I think we're working with a low bedrock of understanding of the system
anyway. That's true everywhere. People don't think about how government works.
But
they just
absolutely.
But
to be fair, we do ask them more, so we've got more data.
But the long-term impact of that is a disinterest in learning more about it, because you get a sort of a low-grade, permanent resting lack of interest. And so when you have a big change like this, my worry is it doesn't actually alter the interest in learning about it. And if the government isn't really proactively putting things through people's post boxes, and what I'm thinking about in that sense is, like the document we got before the European referendum, where a thing actually came through the post box neutrally from the government saying this would mean this and this would mean this. And I don't know that enough has been done to tell people about the new system that's coming to adequately educate the electoral population of Wales.
I'm not really sure that matters to most people ultimately.
No, that's a typical Labour response.
But I think that,
we'll fix it in committee.
No, I knock doors and speak to people to explain how, what elections are about. And most people don't think about voting systems. And we already have a voting system, which is quite complicated. You have 2 votes. And
it's more complicated in some regards.
Exactly. The new system is going to be simpler and easy to understand. The new constituencies are disorientating, and it's going to take people time to get used to that. And change is often resisted and certainly
absolutely
disliked.
But I think for the sort of the twin issue that we have here is a very different kind of election smacking into a very different kind of electoral system. We have, reform on the rise, Plaid Cymru on the rise, the 2 extremes of the system getting more popular and a new system coming through the middle.
I do think that's, the translation of the way the parties look into the election via the electoral system is an important one, because if it had been STV, reform probably wouldn't do as well as they're likely to do, because they're not many people's second choice. Yeah. Whereas the case for for Labour, Plaid and the Lib Dems, and probably the Greens as well, they would have potentially picked up more second and third choices and so on. So electoral systems always have an impact, but the voters don't necessarily... There's an argument to say voters don't necessarily need to know all of that, but in some systems they do, because you're making preferential choices. So you have a hierarchy of how you want to see your voice heard representationally. I guess it depends how much import you put on the autonomy of voters choosing their representatives, and whether you think parties are a better agent for that.
I think when they're no longer going in to vote for a person, when it comes down to the apathetic conversation a voter has with themselves on polling day, or I've got to do the school run, I haven't made supper yet, am I going to go and vote for this individual who I quite like? Am I even voting for that person anymore? I don't know. I think a decision then trends towards the apathy result.
It's a big change to the British political tradition. However, it happens in lots of countries already without any fuss. It just takes time to get used to.
We're not lots of countries, Lee.
Well, and let's not exaggerate that, Lee, because closed list PR isn't widely used in Europe. Yeah. Open list PR is, closed list is.
I mean, it's used in more of the dictatorial systems.
But the context of that.
But the context is it's already used in Wales.
Yes, in a part.
But the regional list system is exactly what we're going to be seeing.
Yes, exactly.
But there's still a constituency link with an individual.
Yeah, it was aligned with the first past the post constituency.
This is the big concern that I have, is we've got these mega constituencies. I believe that we're going to see a concentration of where these MSs are living within those mega constituencies, and that the rural areas will be negatively impacted by their representatives not really living in their local communities.
Yeah, sure. So there's lots of complexity here and some confusion for sure. Laura, in terms of how the mechanics of how the system work, if people want to understand that a bit more, where would you signpost them to?
Well, I think there's 2 obvious sources. My good colleague Jack Larner in the Wales Governance Centre has written a fair bit about that, and the people can access that via the Cardiff University Think in Wales blog. And then the Senedd as well has done some really useful explainers about the new electoral system and how it will operate. So rather than us go through all that detail, I think it's as well to signpost people to those.
But if you do want us to go into these sort of things, then do let us know. We're here to serve, and we're looking for other topics that to go through. But this is an example of what Ron Davies described as devolution being a process, not an event. These things are not linear, and they're certainly not tidy. There's lots of mess involved in politics and compromise, and I think the voting system and how it's emerged and how it'll work
exemplifies that.
Is a very good example of the mess that is the reality of decision making in complex society. So that's all we've got time for today. Do follow us, subscribe so you don't miss further episodes. Follow us on the social media accounts, and we'll be back again next time with more unpacking of how this fascinating development in Welsh politics is going to play out over the next few months.